When mail carrier Darius Carter knocked on the door that morning, he thought it would be just another routine delivery. But the moment the door slowly creaked open, he froze. Standing in front of him was Mrs. Thompson, a quiet elderly woman he had delivered mail to for years. But the woman staring back at him now barely looked like the same person. Her clothes were stained. Her hands trembled against the doorframe. And there was something terribly wrong about the way she stood there, like she didn't have the strength to remain on her feet. Then Darius glanced past her shoulder and looked inside the house. What he saw in that moment made his heart start racing. Because suddenly, this wasn't just a delivery anymore. It was the beginning of a situation that could quickly turn into a life-or-death emergency. Before we get into what happened next, comment below where you're watching or listening from today. And if you enjoy powerful real-life stories like this one, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next one. He almost didn't stop. That's the part that keeps Darius Carter up at night, even now. The thought that on any other Tuesday, on any other ordinary morning filled with overflowing mail bags and a lukewarm cup of gas station coffee, he might have just dropped the package at the door, initialed his scanner, and driven away. He almost did. He was running behind schedule that morning. Not badly, maybe 12 minutes, but enough that the small voice in the back of his head was already doing math. 14 more stops before Crescent Hill Road. 3 packages that needed signatures. And the Carter boy street always had dogs. Darius had been a mail carrier for going on 11 years. He knew his routes the way a surgeon knows anatomy. Every driveway, every broken mailbox post, every yapping dog behind every wooden fence. He knew the people, too. Not deeply. Not the way neighbors know each other through years of borrowed sugar and shared fence lines. But he knew them the way only someone who shows up at their door 6 days a week can. In glimpses. A woman in her bathrobe dragging a garbage can to the curb. A retired man who always had his American flag out by 7. Little details that, over time, paint a picture of a life. He knew Margaret Thompson the same way. He turned onto Sycamore Drive just after 9 in the morning. It was early spring, the kind of morning where the air can't quite decide if it wants to be warm or cold, and the sky sits low and gray like a held breath. The tulips in the front yards were just beginning to push up through dark soil. Someone had their sprinkler running already, even though it was barely above 50 degrees. Darius pulled his truck to a stop in front of 412 Sycamore Drive, a small, neatly kept brick house with white shutters and a concrete front path bordered by overgrown boxwoods. The house had character. It was the kind of place where you could tell someone had cared for it for a long time, even if the caring had gotten harder to keep up in recent years. The paint on the shutters was peeling slightly at the corners. One of the boxwoods was growing sideways. The welcome mat at the front door, a faded sunflower design, was so worn you could barely make out the flowers anymore. He grabbed the package from the back. Medium-sized. From a pharmacy in Tennessee. He noticed the return address the way he always did. Not nosily, just occupationally. A mail carrier's eye catches labels the way a fisherman's eye catches movement in water. The pharmacy label had come up before on deliveries to this address. Medications. Or maybe medical supplies. He never thought much about it. He walked up the concrete path and knocked. And the door opened in a way that made him stop breathing for just a second. Before we go any further, you need to understand who Margaret Thompson was. Because she was not just an elderly woman in a house. She was a whole life. Margaret Louise Thompson, née Whitaker, was born in 1941 in a small town in rural Georgia, the third of 5 children. Her father worked the rail yards. Her mother took in laundry and mending. They were not wealthy. They were not always comfortable. But they were proud, and they were hardworking, and they raised their children to be both of those things. Margaret had been sharp as a tack her entire life. She'd worked as a bookkeeper for 32 years at a manufacturing company, raised 2 children, a son named David who now lived in Oregon, and a daughter named Carol who had settled in Massachusetts, and had been, by every account, the backbone of her family. When the kids had nightmares, they came to her. When her husband Gerald couldn't balance the household accounts, she sat down with him at the kitchen table on Sunday evenings and sorted it out. When the neighborhood association needed someone to organize the annual 4th of July block party, Margaret Thompson's name was the first one mentioned. Gerald had died of a heart attack 6 years ago. He'd been outside raking leaves on an October afternoon, just like any other afternoon, and then he wasn't. Margaret had been the one to find him. She'd called 911 herself. She'd answered the paramedics' questions. She'd signed the paperwork at the hospital. And then she'd gone home and sat in the kitchen alone and stared at the 2 coffee cups on the counter, the ones they'd used that morning, still not washed. And she had not cried until the middle of the night, when there was no one to be strong for anymore. After Gerald, the house got quieter. David called on Sundays. Carol called on Wednesdays. They visited for Christmas and sometimes in the summer. They worried about their mother, in the distracted, guilty way that adult children living far away worry about aging parents. A low-grade hum of concern that's easy to push to the background when your own life is loud enough. Margaret told them she was fine. She was not fine. 18 months before that Tuesday morning, Margaret had been diagnosed with colorectal cancer. Stage 2. Treatable. The doctors were careful to use that word. But serious. She had gone through surgery, then chemotherapy, then more surgery. She had lost 22 pounds. She had lost most of her hair. She had sat in treatment chairs for hours at a time, watching the foredrip, listening to the soft beeps of machines, making small talk with nurses whose names she tried hard to remember because she felt it was important to know people's names. She had not told David and Carol how bad it was. She didn't want to worry them. She didn't want them to upend their lives. She was, at her core, a woman who had spent 8 to 2 years taking care of other people, and she simply did not know how to be the one who needed taking care of. She had been discharged from the hospital 3 weeks before that Tuesday morning. The discharge had been rushed. Not maliciously. The hospital was overwhelmed. Beds were needed, and Margaret's chart indicated she had a home to go to. A social worker had stopped by her room the morning of discharge and gone over a list of resources. Home health aides, meal delivery services, follow-up appointment numbers. Margaret had nodded and said yes and taken the papers. She had not made any of the calls. Not because she didn't need help. She needed help desperately. But making those calls meant admitting something she had not yet found the words to admit, even to herself. She was alone, and she was not okay, and she could not manage this by herself. So instead, she had been managing it badly, getting up each morning and shuffling to the kitchen and trying to eat something even though nothing tasted like food anymore, taking her medications when she remembered, sleeping more than she ever had in her life, moving slowly through her small house like a person navigating in low light, carefully, cautiously, conserving every bit of energy she had. Darius had seen her only twice in the 3 weeks since her discharge. Both times she'd opened the door herself, accepted the mail, thanked him. He'd thought she looked tired, a bit pale. He'd thought old age. He had not thought crisis. Not yet. The door opened slowly. That was the first thing. It usually opened quickly, not swung wide, but opened with the kind of ease that says the person on the other side is upright and mobile. That morning it opened inch by inch, like something heavy was being moved aside. Margaret appeared in the gap. She was wearing a loose white button-down shirt, the kind with no collar, something between a blouse and a nightgown, and white cotton pants. Her feet were in house slippers. Her hair, thin and white and freshly grown back in soft tufts after chemo, was uncombed. She was holding the doorframe with her left hand. Darius said good morning. He held out the package. He smiled the way he always smiled. Wide, easy, the kind of smile that had become as much a part of his uniform as the blue cap in the mailbag. And then he looked down. Later, when he tried to explain it to the 911 dispatcher, he struggled to describe exactly what he saw. It wasn't a gash. It wasn't a wound that was bleeding fresh and actively. It was more like a staining, dark reddish-brown, already dried in some parts and still damp in others, spreading down the front of her white pants from somewhere around her midsection and down her inner left thigh. His brain tried to explain it away immediately. That's what brains do. It tried. Spill tomato sauce. Cranberry juice. Something she dropped while cooking. But none of those made sense with a pattern. The stain was coming from her body, not from outside it. He looked up at her face. She was already looking at him. And in her eyes, behind the polite, almost automatic smile she'd arranged for his benefit, there was something he had never seen there before in 5 years of Tuesday and Thursday deliveries. Exhaustion so deep it had gone past tired and into something else. Something closer to surrender. He said. He kept his voice even. Gentle. Are you doing okay this morning? She adjusted her grip on the doorframe. Reached her other hand out for the package. Oh, I'm fine, she said. Just a little accident. You know how it is. Her voice was thinner than he remembered, like paper that had been folded too many times. Do you need me to call someone for you? He asked. A neighbor, maybe. Something moved across her face. Pride, maybe, or pain. It was hard to tell the difference. No, she said. I'm perfectly fine. Thank you, Darius. She took the package. She smiled again, and this time it almost reached her eyes. He said goodbye. He walked back down the concrete path. He got in his truck. He sat there for 37 seconds before he drove away. He counted them later. It bothered him, those 37 seconds, that he'd spent them arguing with himself instead of acting. But at the time, the argument felt necessary. She was a grown woman. She had her dignity. She'd said she was fine. Who was he to push? He drove away. But he couldn't leave it alone. Hey is something they don't teach you in postal training, but that every veteran carrier knows. People have patterns. A route is not just a series of addresses. It's a series of human rhythms. The woman who walks her golden retriever at 8:15 every morning without exception. The retired firefighter who collects his mail the moment the truck rounds the corner, like he's been watching for it. The college student whose package volume spikes every January and every August. Moving in, moving out, the rhythm of life in motion. Darius had been watching Margaret Thompson's rhythm for 5 years. Not intrusively, not with any agenda, just the way a person who shows up somewhere regularly begins to notice things. He knew that she usually had her outside light on until about 9:30 in the morning. He knew that she watered her boxwoods on Wednesdays when the weather was dry. He knew that in the year after her husband passed, the volume of her mail had changed. More cards at first, then fewer, then almost none, then back to just the bills and the catalogs and the occasional package. The mathematics of grief played out in postal volume. He knew that she always came to the door herself. Margaret Thompson did not leave packages on the stoop. She wasn't that kind of person. Even on cold days, even when she was clearly not feeling well, she came to the door. She accepted her mail. She said thank you. It was important to her. He'd figured that out a long time ago. Having someone come to your door when you live alone, it matters. Even if it's just the mailman. Maybe especially if it's just the mailman. As Darius drove his route that morning, these thoughts kept circling back. The stain. The way she'd held the doorframe. The thinness of her voice. The package. A pharmacy shipment. Which meant medication. Which meant she was sick enough to be managing medications regularly. And something else. Something that didn't fully crystallize until he was 3 stops down the road. In the past 3 weeks, since she'd come back looking different and moving slowly, she hadn't been outside once. Not to check the garden. Not to drag her trash cans to the curb on collection day. Not to sit on the front porch the way she used on mild afternoons, with a glass of iced tea and a paperback novel. He'd been leaving her packages at the door. She was moving so slowly she could barely get to the door in time for a knock. She wasn't going to make it outside on her own terms. He finished the rest of his deliveries on Sycamore Drive and the 2 streets that followed mechanically, his body doing the work while his mind stayed back at 412. He told himself he was overreacting. He told himself she'd said she was fine. He told himself it was none of his business. He finished his route for that section of the neighborhood. He turned the truck around. He pulled back up to 412 Sycamore at 12:43 in the afternoon. He sat in the truck for a moment before getting out. He still wasn't sure he was doing the right thing. There's a particular kind of vulnerability in going back, in saying, with your body, I was worried about you. People don't always want to be worried about. Sometimes it makes them feel worse. He got out anyway. The first thing he noticed was the package. It was sitting exactly where he had left it, on the welcome mat, just to the left of the door, exactly as he'd placed it at 9:14 that morning, still in the same position, unmoved, with the pharmacy label facing up. 3 hours. She hadn't picked it up. Something cold moved through him. He walked up the path and knocked. A firm, clear knock. Not aggressive, not the knock of someone demanding entry, but the knock of someone who needed to know the person inside was okay. Nothing. He waited. He knocked again, louder this time. Silence from inside the house. He pressed his ear lightly toward the door, not touching it, just tilting toward it, the way you do when you're listening for something without wanting to admit you're listening. No television, no radio, no sound of movement, just the ambient hush of an empty-seeming house. He stepped back and looked at the windows. The curtains were drawn across every single one. That same breathless stillness. He knocked a third time and called through the door. Mrs. Thompson? It's Darius, from the post office. I just wanted to make sure you're doing okay. His voice bounced off the door and came back to him in the quiet air. Nothing. He put his hand on the door handle. He almost didn't. He stood there for a long moment with his hand on the handle, having what was probably the most consequential internal argument of his life. He was a mail carrier, not a paramedic. He had no right to enter someone's home uninvited. She was an adult who had told him she was fine. She might be asleep. She might be in the shower. She might be on the phone with her daughter, completely unaware that some well-meaning postal worker was standing at her front door working up the nerve to trespass. And if she was any of those things, she would be embarrassed. Or angry. And he would be in trouble. He pushed the thought aside. He pressed down on the handle. The door was unlocked. It swung inward an inch. He didn't go in. Let that be clear. Darius Carter, to his credit and his caution, did not step a single foot inside that house. He stood on the threshold, his hand on the doorframe, and he leaned forward just far enough to look. What he saw in those few seconds would stay with him for a long time. The living room was dim. All the lights were off, and the drawn curtains turned the afternoon light to a dull gray sieve. He could make out the shapes of furniture, a couch, an armchair, a coffee table with papers and pill bottles scattered across it. Family photographs along the wall, too many to count. A small television. A walker, the kind with tennis ball feet, parked near the entrance to the hallway. The walker stopped him. He hadn't seen a walker before. She had never used a walker when she came to the door. She'd always just walked, slowly, sometimes carefully, but walked. That walker meant something had changed. Something significant. He called her name again. Louder now. Mrs. Thompson. Margaret. Can you hear me? And then, faint, from somewhere deeper in the house, maybe the hallway or the kitchen, a sound. Not words. Not a voice, exactly. More like a breath with weight behind it. Like someone trying to respond and not having enough air to complete the thought. That was enough. Darius stepped back from the doorway, pulled out his phone, and called 911. His hands, he noticed, were steady. He was surprised by that. He felt shaky on the inside. His heart was hammering. His thoughts were loud. But his hands were completely still as he held the phone to his ear and listened to it ring. 911. What's your emergency? He took a breath. I need an ambulance, he said. I'm at 412, Sycamore Drive. There's an elderly woman inside the house and I don't think she can get to the door. The door is unlocked. She made a sound when I called her name, but she can't respond. I'm her mail carrier. I've been delivering here for 5 years and something is very wrong. Emergency response time in that part of town averaged 7 minutes. Darius stood on the front path for all 7 of them. He didn't go inside. The 911 dispatcher had told him to stay where he was, to keep the line open, to call back immediately if he heard anything change from inside the house. So he stood there with the phone in his hand and watched the empty street and tried to breathe normally. He called out to Margaret once more through the open door, just to let her know someone was coming, just so she wouldn't be alone in there, not knowing. "Mrs. Thompson," he called. "Help is on the way. You hold on, okay? Just hold on. Someone is coming." He didn't know if she heard him. He hoped she heard him. The ambulance arrived at 12:51, a fire engine 1 minute behind it. 2 paramedics jogged up the path, gear bags on their shoulders. A police officer followed them up the steps. Darius stepped aside and pointed to the door. "She's inside," he said. "I heard her. It was just a sound, not words, somewhere in the back of the house. The walker near the hallway is new. She wasn't using one before." The paramedic, a compact woman with close-cropped hair and the focused, unruffled expression of someone who has seen everything, gave him a quick nod that said both "thank you" and "we've got it now." They went inside. Darius stayed on the path. He could hear them moving through the house. Voices, calm and professional. Footsteps. Equipment sounds. The particular busy silence of people who know exactly what they are doing. And then, "Can you hear me? My name is Kara. I'm a paramedic. You're going to be okay. We've got you." And then, very faintly, from inside, a voice, barely a whisper. Darius closed his eyes. Margaret Thompson was discovered collapsed in the hallway between her bedroom and the bathroom. She was conscious. That was the first piece of good news. She was conscious, and she recognized the paramedics as helpers, and she was able to respond, after a moment, to basic questions. Her name, the date, the year. She got the year right, but she was in serious trouble. The paramedics' initial assessment in those first minutes told a story that got worse the more they looked. Her blood pressure was critically low. Her pulse was weak and rapid. Her skin was dry and cool to the touch, classic signs of severe dehydration. When they checked her extremities, her hands and feet were cold. When they tried to find a vein for an line, it took 3 attempts. She was malnourished. Not starving, not the visible, acute kind you see in extreme cases, but the slow, grinding kind that happens when someone stops eating properly over weeks, when everything tastes like nothing and the act of preparing food requires more energy than you have. And so you eat crackers and half a can of soup and call it a day, and you do it again the next day, and the next, and after a while your body starts quietly consuming itself. And the stain that Darius had noticed that morning, the dark reddish-brown spreading down her white pants, was from a wound related to her post-surgical recovery. A drainage complication, the kind that requires careful monitoring and daily wound care. The kind that, without a home health nurse or a caregiver, an 82-year-old woman living alone would have no realistic way to properly manage. The wound had been untreated for days. She had not called a doctor. She had not called her children. She had not called anyone, because she had not wanted to be a burden. Let that land for a moment. This woman, who had worked for 32 years, who had raised 2 children, who had been the person everyone else leaned on for the better part of 6 decades, had been lying on her hallway floor, alone, in pain, dehydrated, and silently bleeding, 4 hours, maybe longer, and she had not called anyone because she did not want to impose. The paramedics loaded her onto the stretcher with the practiced efficiency of people who have done this 1,000 times. But Kara, the compact woman with the close-cropped hair who had been first to her side, took a moment, before they moved her, to hold Margaret's hand and look her in the eye. "You did good," she said quietly, "letting us in. You did good." Margaret looked up at her. Her eyes were wet. "I didn't let you in," she said. "The young man did." Kara nodded. "Then he did good." They rolled her out into the afternoon light. Margaret was admitted to the emergency department of St. Catherine's Medical Center at approximately 1:15 in the afternoon. The ER team worked quickly. Fluids first. 2 large bore fours. Saline running wide open to try to bring her pressure up. Blood draws. An EKG. A chest x-ray, done right there in the bay. The wound assessment, which confirmed what the paramedics had suspected. It needed immediate cleaning, redressing, and close monitoring. Her daughter Carol got the call at 2:30 that afternoon. She had been in a staff meeting when her phone buzzed. Unknown Tennessee area code, which she almost didn't answer. And then the voice of a hospital social worker telling her that her mother had been transported to St. Catherine's and was currently being stabilized. Carol later said that the word stabilized was the first thing she heard, and she had to ask the social worker to repeat everything that came before it because the word stabilized meant that there had been something to stabilize, which meant that things had been, before this moment, unstable, which meant she had not known, and that not knowing hit her like something physical. She drove to the airport directly from the office parking lot. David, reached by phone 2 hours later, booked the next flight from Portland. They had not known. Their mother had not told them. And that, in its own way, was its own kind of emergency. Margaret was moved from the ER to a medical wardroom late that evening. She was on full fluids and oxygen. She was on a careful nutritional protocol. A wound care specialist had seen her and begun the process of proper treatment. Her vital signs were improving. She was going to be okay. Not fine, not right away. She had weeks of recovery ahead of her. There were additional medical concerns to address and discharge plans to build properly this time, with teeth. But okay. She was going to be okay. Carol arrived at 11 that night. She walked into her mother's room and stood at the side of the bed for a long moment. And Margaret looked up at her, and neither of them said anything for a while. Then Margaret said, "I didn't want to worry you." Carol sat down in the chair beside the bed and took her mother's hand, the one without the thin one with the papery skin and the knuckles that had always looked like her mother's, even when she was a child, and she held it. "Mom," she said, and her voice cracked right down the middle of the word. "That's what we're here for." Darius Carter went back to the post office that afternoon and filed an incident report. It was standard procedure. He filled out the form in the break room with a cup of coffee he didn't drink, and when his supervisor asked him if he was okay, he said yes, and then sat there for a minute and then said, "Actually, I don't know." His supervisor pulled up a chair. Darius talked for a while. About Margaret. About the stain. About the 37 seconds he'd sat in the truck before driving away. About going back. About the package on the mat. About the sound from inside the house. His supervisor listened without interrupting. When Darius was done, his supervisor was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know what separates a good carrier from a great one?" Darius shook his head. A great carrier knows the difference between a route and a community. Darius thought about that a lot in the days that followed. He went back to Sycamore Drive the next Tuesday. There was no mail for 412, or at least, nothing that required a stop, but he drove past anyway. The welcome mat was still there. The boxwood still growing sideways. The outside light was off. He found out through a neighbor, Mrs. Oldgate, 3 houses down, who had been one of the first to hear the ambulance, that Margaret had been taken to St. Catherine's, that she was there for at least a week, that her daughter had flown in from Boston. He sent a card, not an elaborate one, just a simple get-well card from the grocery store, the kind with a generic flower on the front. He wrote inside, "Mrs. Thompson, I hope you're feeling stronger every day. Your mail is waiting when you get back. Darius." He wasn't sure she'd care about the mail. He sent it anyway. Let's take a moment here, because this story is not just about one man's instinct. It is also about a failure, a systemic, preventable, devastating failure that nearly cost an 82-year-old woman her life. Margaret Thompson had been discharged from St. Catherine's Medical Center following her most recent surgical procedure 3 weeks before Darius found her on the floor. She had gone through a serious, complicated cancer surgery. She had a wound requiring daily professional care. She was malnourished and physically depleted from months of treatment. She was 82 years old. She lived alone, and she was sent home with a packet of papers and a handshake. Not a home health aide arranged in advance. Not a mandatory follow-up call within 48 hours. Not a neighbor contact or family member notified. A packet of papers and the assumption that she would navigate the resources herself. This is not uncommon. In hospitals across the country, discharge planning for elderly patients, particularly those who live alone, who have limited family support nearby, and who are, by nature, unlikely to ask for help, is frequently inadequate. Social workers are overextended. Beds are needed. The pressure to discharge is constant and real. But the gap between the hospital's doors and the patient's front door can be a dangerous place. And for the most vulnerable patients, the ones who are most likely to say I'm fine, who are most likely to not want to impose, who are most likely to quietly deteriorate at home without anyone knowing, that gap can be fatal. In Margaret's case, it nearly was. Following her admission, the hospital conducted an internal review of her discharge process. The review found multiple points at which a different decision could have changed the outcome. A follow-up call that was scheduled but not made. A home health referral that was discussed but not finalized. A notation in her chart about her living situation, alone, family out of state, that had not been flagged to the discharge planning team. The review resulted in a policy update. New protocols around elderly patients discharged to independent living situations. A mandatory 48-hour post-discharge phone check-in. A flagging system for high-risk discharge cases. It was progress. Real, meaningful progress. It came too late for Margaret, and not too late, because Darius had been paying attention. She was discharged, properly, this time, 17 days after she was admitted. Carol had stayed for 2 weeks. She and David had had a long, difficult, overdue conversation with their mother about what she needed and what she had been hiding and why. It was the kind of conversation that families should have long before they are forced to have it, but often don't, because everybody is afraid of what it means. It means, you are getting older. It means, you cannot do this alone. It means, we love you and we need you to let us in. Margaret had cried. She had apologized. And then she had said, very quietly, that she was afraid. That admitting she needed help felt like admitting something was over. Like surrendering something she had spent her whole life holding together. Carol had understood. David had understood. And they had told her, as clearly and as gently as they could, that asking for help was not surrender. That needing people was not weakness. That she had spent decades being there for everyone else. And now it was okay. Now it was finally okay to let someone be there for her. A home health aide began coming every morning. A meal delivery service started up for lunch and dinner. A medical alert device, the kind with a button on a lanyard, was discussed, and after some resistance, agreed upon. Carol set up a standing twice-weekly video call, not just the Wednesday phone check-in. David booked a trip for the following month. When Margaret came home to 412 Sycamore Drive on a Wednesday afternoon in early May, the tulips she'd missed seeing come up were long finished. But the boxwoods had been trimmed. Carol had done it herself one morning while Margaret was still in the hospital, something to do with her hands, and someone had replaced the worn-out sunflower welcome mat. Margaret stood on the front path for a moment before going inside. Just stood there in the spring afternoon, the mild air on her face, looking at her house. Then she went in. 3 weeks after Margaret came home, Darius was back on his route. It was a Thursday, which wasn't always a delivery day for Sycamore Drive, but there was a package, something from her daughter. The return address said Boston, and he brought it up to the door himself rather than leaving it, the way he always had. He knocked. The door opened more quickly this time. Margaret stood in the doorway. She was thinner than she'd been before her illness, and she was holding the doorframe still, old habit, on new caution. But she was upright. She was wearing a proper blouse and slacks. Her hair was combed. There was color in her cheeks that hadn't been there in months. She looked at him for a moment. And her eyes, those tired, surrendered eyes he remembered from that morning in early spring, were different now. Still old, still worn, but present, back from wherever they had gone. "Well," she said, "there he is." Darius smiled. "There you are." She accepted the package. She looked at it for a moment. From Carol. He'd been right. "I heard you sent a card," she said. "I did. I got it." She paused. "It was the first piece of mail I read when I got home. Before the bills. Before the catalogs. I read that first." He didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded. She looked at him steadily for a moment. Then she said, "You know, I almost didn't answer the door that morning. I almost let you knock and go away. I was so embarrassed. I thought, he'll just leave it and go. I can manage." "I almost did leave," Darius said. "I sat in the truck." She nodded slowly, like something was being confirmed. "But you came back." "I came back." Another pause. The spring air between them. The worn-down boxwoods and the new welcome mat. "Thank you," she said. And she said it the way people say it when they mean more than those two words can hold. He said, "Yes." And he said it the way people say it when they understand. He walked back down the concrete path. At the end of the walk, he turned once and looked back at the house. She was still standing in the doorway, holding the package from her daughter. Then he got in the truck and drove on. There will be people who hear this story and call Darius Carter a hero. He would be the first to tell you that word doesn't fit. He didn't run into a burning building. He didn't perform surgery. He didn't do anything that required specialized training or extraordinary bravery. He delivered mail and noticed something and went back to check and made a phone call. That's the whole of it. And yet, in a world where we are all moving faster, looking at smaller screens, living in a more isolated way than at any other point in human history, in that world, the act of simply paying attention to the person in front of you has become, without anyone quite meaning for it to happen, a kind of radical act. There are an estimated 8 million older adults in the United States who are considered severely socially isolated. Not lonely in the casual sense, not just wishing they had more friends, but genuinely, structurally cut off from regular human contact. No spouse, children far away, neighbors who have moved or passed away, lives that have gradually, quietly contracted until the circle of regular human contact has shrunk to a pharmacist, a delivery driver, and a mailman. For those people, the mail carrier is often not just a mail carrier. They are one of the only consistent points of contact with the outside world. One of the only people who will notice if something is wrong. There are actually formal programs built on this understanding. The U.S. Postal Service has piloted a program called Carrier Alert that allows mail carriers to flag unusual mail accumulation or other signs of concern at the homes of enrolled elderly residents. Some rural letter carriers have found people who had fallen, had strokes, had medical emergencies, because they were the person who came to the door, because they noticed. Darius didn't know about Carrier Alert. He wasn't trained for this. He just knew Margaret Thompson's rhythm, and he knew it was broken, and he went back. That's the thing about this story that deserves to be said out loud. Saving someone's life doesn't always look like heroism. Sometimes it looks like hesitation and second-guessing and sitting in a truck for 37 seconds and deciding anyway. Sometimes it looks like a get-well card from the grocery store. Sometimes it looks like knocking on a door a second time, and a third, because something in your gut tells you that this matters, and you have learned, or maybe you were born knowing, that the voice in your gut is worth listening to. Margaret Thompson is still living at 412 Sycamore Drive. She gets her mail every week. Sometimes she comes to the door herself. Sometimes her home health aide gets it. But on the days she comes to the door herself, she and Darius exchange a few words. About the weather. About the garden. About nothing in particular. About something in particular. He was asked once, by a reporter doing a small local piece about the story, what he would say to other mail carriers or other people in any service role who see the same people day after day, about what they can do. He thought about it for a moment. Then he said, just see them. That's all. You see somebody every week. You know them a little. Just really see them. Not past them. Not through them. See them. And when something's different, trust that you noticed. He paused. People try to be invisible when they are struggling, he said. They don't want to be a burden. They'll hide it if they can. So sometimes the kindest thing you can do is just not let them. There are people in your neighborhood right now who are struggling alone. You might be the only person who would notice. Would you go back? If this story moved you, share it. Someone you know might need to hear it today.